Hi, welcome back. In the last video, we saw how we could create our database models and then create a controller that would allow us to interface with that model and, with the database that is behind. What we're going to do together today is we're going to look at a module that is given by Caligraphy out of the box, and that is the Authentication Module. So what does authentication mean? In any application that you visit today, specifically transactional web applications such as e-commerce and things like that, there's always a need to authenticate the person or the user who is interfacing with your application. So authentication is really about giving the ability for the user to identify themselves within your application in order for you to either personalize certain content or give them access to certain features or restrict them from accessing certain features. So that is in just what authentication is about. Now, Calligraphy comes prepackaged with an authentication system, a very simple basic authorization system that comes directly from the source code. Of course, there is a need to activate that authentication mechanism when you're using it. So this session is going to be about showing you how to activate that module, and two, try to re-engineer it in a very simplistic way so that we understand how it works. And eventually, towards the end of the video, in the third part of this session, we're going to see how you could use this module out of the box along with all the views and all the forms that it comes pre-packaged with. So without further ado, let's go and look at the code together. In the last video, what we did, so we created this poster controller.php. Of course, if you're following the videos in the order, then probably this would make more sense to you. If you're not, then I would encourage you to take a look at a video called CRUD operations on databases or models and controllers, depending where you're accessing these videos from. So take a look at them because they introduce you to how to create models, database models, and how to create controllers that could interface with the database. So if you haven't seen that video, I would strongly encourage you to do so before getting into this video. As far as authentication is concerned, and as far as this session is concerned, I'm going to start probably by showing you where the authentication module and where the authentication classes are in Calligraphy, so that if in the future you want to make modifications or if you want to personalize them, then you would know where they are. So for the time being, we are going to close the poster controller.php, and then I will show you where in the structure you can find the modules that you need for authentication mainly. Of course, there is one primary class where authentication is implemented, and that is under the framework, under the core folder. There is an auth.php class, and it's really within that class where you can find the main methods that are used for authentication. Of course, you do not need to make any changes to this class unless you want to change the behavior, but I would strongly encourage you to understand first how it works before making any modifications to it. What you need to understand is that the brain for authentication is all contained within this auth.php. Now, there are some additional core helper methods that have been created that kind of call these methods from within, and these can be found under the helpers, under the core helpers. So you can find them there. If I go to the core helpers, you can find in there a set of methods. If I go look at authorize, for instance, so you can find a set of methods that are global and that can be used across Calligraphy across any class that you create within Calligraphy, and those methods are accessible whether from the context of a controller or from the context of any class that you create within the application folder. I will talk more about these methods when we start implementing our own controller. Okay, so this was the second piece of code that can be interesting for you to look at. Now, whenever you're creating and I will close this. So whenever you're creating or whenever you want to activate the authentication, first you need to make sure that there is a model for your users. Okay, we can only talk about authentication if we have a model for the users, and Calligraphy comes prepackaged with a poster, with an authentication folder that is under the models, and under this folder you can find two files in it. One file is called, it's a class, and it's called user, and within that class is the definition of the user object that is mirroring the user's table. So Calligraphy uses a user's table and a user model for its authentication module. Now, last time we created our own database, so there is no users in it. What comes out of the box in Calligraphy is the script, the SQL script that will help you create that table, and this is part of the activation process itself. Now, if you want to know more about how to do the activation and more than what I'm going to show you today in the video, then if you go to the documentation, there is a section called Authentication, and it will guide you through each and every step that you need to do in order for you to start using authentication in a seamless way. I will show you a lot of it today in the video, but at least you will have the documentation as a reference whenever you need to visit that again. So the script will create a user's table for you. So let's go ahead and do this. Okay, so we're going to go to phpMyAdmin, or if you prefer to use the terminal, you could do that as well. So when I go to the posters database that we created last time, what we need to do in here is we need to import that script in order for us to create the user's table that comes out of the box with Calligraphy. Okay, so this is createdb.sql. I'm going to go ahead and run it and see what it does. Now when I open it, so if I go, so you can see here the user's table got added. When I go to the structure, let's compare that structure to the SQL code. So you see that the table comes prepackaged with very simplistic and very basic set of properties and attributes for users. So it has a username, it has a passcode, and for the sake of Calligraphy, it has something called permissions, which I will talk about at a later time. But all this is to say is that this table, you can modify it the way you want. Okay, you can add more to it, you could remove some stuff to it. I wouldn't suggest removing properties from it, but rather adding to it, in order for you to personalize it more to the needs of your applications. Now, every time you want to make modifications to the users table, you got to make sure that your user model is mimicking or is mirroring the properties that you can find in the tables as well. Okay, so any change that you make on the script needs to be made on the model as well. Great. So now that we have the model, for the sake of this video, we're going to use exactly the model that comes out of the box along with the table that comes out of the box, so we're not going to make any changes there. But what we're going to act on is really the controller itself. So we are going, despite the fact that Calligraphy comes pre-packaged with a controller for authentication, okay? We will go take a look at it together, but we are going to recreate our own in order for you to know how you could manipulate those the methods that are in the core auth.php file. So let's go take a look at a controller that comes shipped out of the box. That controller comes with four methods. Some of the methods are meant to return views. Okay, so the index that you find in here, for example, that method is meant to return the login form for you. It's meant to take you back to the login form at all times. Now we're not going to talk about views today because there is an entire dedicated video for it that's going to come further down, so I will not spend a lot of time on it, and this is not really what this session is about, so we will learn how to do this later on. Second method that comes out of the box is the register method, and the register method is actually doing very similar things to what we did together in the last video. All it's doing is it's somehow adding a user to the user table by taking, of course, the input from the user form. Okay, so that is really the distinction between what we did together last time and what this method is doing. Okay, so that is the register function. Then there is a login function. What the login is going to be doing, it's going to mainly validate whether and the information that is entered by the user in a form is compliant or matches the record that we created through the register. Okay, this is when we're going to check whether an account exists and if the password that got entered by the user is the same as the one stored in the database. And when this happens, and when this is true, then in that case we are going to authorize the user to use the application. So there is this notion of authorization that comes into play in here. And authorization in the world of calligraphy, what it means that there's a token that's going to be created for that user, and it's a token that is stored in this session, in the PHP session, that allows the user to perform any sort of action without having to log in again and again. So for as long as the session is open and is not updated and is current and not expired or not terminated, then in that case the user can continue to be authorized to use the application. Okay, that's what the login does. Now what the logout is going to do is going to do the opposite of that. Okay, and the logout is calling a core helper function that is in the core helper methods file that we saw earlier. That logout function, what it's going to do, it's going to do the opposite of what login is doing. And what this logout function is doing, it is unauthorizing the user. So what it's doing is it's destroying that session token that got created, and what it's doing is it's redirecting the user to a page once the unauthorization has successfully performed. Okay, so what we're going to do today is at the end of the video we're going to see how all this works out of the box. Okay, but before we get there, I want us to kind of replicate a little bit, at least the register function and the login function. We are definitely going to be hard coding certain things because we're not going to be creating forms or views, so we are going to hard code some stuff in the code, but it's a good practice for us to know how to use the different methods that come in the auth.php file. So let's go ahead and do that. So we are ultimately going to create a controller. Now let's go take a look first, before we get there, at the web.php file, because before we start doing anything there is this element in here, or this statement about authentication. You got to make sure that the authentication is uncommented in your world. So the way it comes out of the box, it comes like this. It is commented because the module is not activated. So we do need to activate it in order for us to be able to use the user model that you can find under models auth in here, and the users table that we just created in the PHP MyAdmin. Okay, we are not going to recreate a model or replicate a model in this case, so we can use that statement as is. Okay, so we got to make sure that this is uncommented for anything that we're going to be doing moving forward. Great. So now we have our tables, we have our models. What we need to do is to create a controller. So let's create that controller inside the posters folder, and let's give it a name that is different from the name that is in here. There's the auth, because we don't want any conflicts. So what we're going to do, we're going to rename it something like a controller. Okay, I'm just going to give it any name for the time being. Or how about user controller? Okay, that would make more sense because we're controlling the user. And let's create our file from scratch. And if you remember well, all of our controllers are classes that need to extend the big core class called controller. And inside this method, we are going to create two methods like we discussed. We are going to create the register method, which is going to add users to our table, because right now our table is empty. And then we are going to create a login method, or at least try and replicate it. Okay, and that is what is going to authorize the user to use certain actions, or to have an authorization to use our routes. So let's go ahead and start with the registration. First thing that we need to do in each and every controller action or controller method that we create is to associate that method with a table. In this case, sorry, it's user. I might make mistakes along the way, but we will correct them as we go. So now that this method is linked to the user table, because this is the table we are going to act on, and this is the model that we're going to act on. So now what we need to do is we need to create an actual user. Of course, we're going to hard code all the values in here. So it's going to be a new user. And then we're going to give that user a username. Let's call it test for the time being, and then we're going to give it a passcode. And for the passcode, we got to make sure that any sensitive data is always encrypted before it gets saved in the database. That is very important, especially if you need to comply with PCI and things like that. You absolutely need all sensitive data to be encrypted. Now, Calligraphy comes with a method out of the box that is called Decrypt, which you could check under either in the documentation or in the core helpers file directly. And that method takes, the action that you want to take. In this case, we want to encrypt. And what do we want to encrypt? We want to encrypt a value that we're going to enter in a hard-coded way. Now, ideally, in an ideal world, these need to be taken from a form, but of course, we're just putting them directly in the code just to make things a little easier for now. And then when we start talking about views and things like that, then we'll have more of a reason to create that. So now that I have a user, notice that I don't need to specify the permissions, because the permissions, if we look in here, can be null. Okay, so it's not a required value. Now what we need to do is we need to save that user. And just for us to be able to test out whether the function worked or not, let's dump that value for the time being. Great, and this should be it. And now what do we do after we finish a controller logic? We always need to go back to the route and make sure that we have a route for that particular method. So what we're going to do is we're going to say we're going to do /add user. Whether you put a slash or not, by the way, it doesn't make a difference. And then it's going to go to user controller, and then we're going to say it's the register action. Great. Let's go and test out what we just created. So if I go to localhost, no, you don't want to go to meta, we want to go to poster, and then we're going to do add user. Oh, something happened. Ideally, a user was created. So let's go to our user table. And in fact, it seems that I had one from before, which let me delete it again. Okay, make sure we do this right. So let's do add user, and now let's go back here, and here we go. Okay, we just created a user, and notice how the passcode is encrypted. Okay, so there's you're not able to see the value, at least not in the database. Okay, great. So now that we created our user and our user controller, our next step is to create this other function, because the register we're not going to use anymore unless we want to create a new user. At least we have one in the database right now. What we need to do is we need to validate whether the user that we're just going to create has the same password as the one stored in the database. And if it's the case, then we're going to authorize that user to use the application. So we definitely need to associate first. Again, yes, again. You need to do this because once you get into the habit of it, it becomes quite an efficient thing to do, especially if you want to handle multiple tables or multiple models from within the same action. So getting used to doing it becomes good practice, and it always keeps you focused on what context you're working with. Great. So now we do create, we need to create like just to mimic a login form. So we need to create a user, and we're going to say that user did enter a username, and let's say they entered the username test, surprise, surprise, and then they entered a passcode that is 1234, but we're going to immediately encrypt it as well in this case, because that's what we're comparing. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, great. So now we have that user encrypted. Now what we need to do is we need to check whether this username exists in the database. And if that user exists, then we're going to compare the password that is here to the password that is in the database. This is exactly what a login function ends up doing at the end of the day. So let's see how we could do that here. We do have a function in the controller that's called search. Now in our previous video we saw another function called find. What find does, it looks only into the IDs. Okay, so find tries to look for an ID, whereas search, it can search any column in a database. We need to specify which column. That would be called the scope. So the scope is the column, and then it searches for a match, for a string match within that column. So here's what we're going to do. In our particular case, we're going to say, let's for the time being try to output the results so that you guys know what comes out of that search method. So let's say let's call it find. Let's call it find this, and we're going to say search. And what are we going to search? We're going to search the username column, and we're going to look for test, right? And let's dump find so that you guys see what comes out of this one. And of course, this is a good opportunity for us to go and create a route, because we always need a route, otherwise we won't be able to redirect to that function. And we're going to call it login for the time being, and then we're going to say user controller at login. Great. So let's go in here and then let's say login. Okay, apparently encrypt. I might have mistyped something in here. Yep, it's encrypt decrypt, just like the crypt. Now we got it, unless there's another error somewhere. Okay, so what it does is the search, it returns an array of users. Okay, keep that in mind. It is returning an array. Why? Because it could be more than one element in some cases. Probably not in this particular case, but in some cases it could be more than one user. So really what this one is returning, it's returning found user with an S, because it's an array of element. Now there's something that we need to do, is that no matter how many it found, we're always going to take the first one in that array. We're always going to take the first found element. So we could directly say that if $found users, first of all, if the array is not empty, okay, so it's going to check that, and if it's set, we're going to check if the first element exists, okay, and if both of them are true, then in that case what we want to do, we're going to have to look for the password now, Now we got to make sure that this password matches that password. In order for us to do that, we need to check. Well, first of all, we need to take that password and we need to decrypt both. Okay, so that's probably the easiest way to do it for the time being. Now there are more secure ways to do that, but for the purpose of this exercise, it would be best if we do it this way. So we're going to decrypt. And what are we going to decrypt? We're going to decrypt $user passcode. Okay, and we're going to see if it's equals to the decryption of the password that comes from the database this time. So it's going to be $found users at 0. And what do we want from the user? And it's an object, so what we want is the passcode. And we're going to call decrypt as well in this particular case. Maybe just to make things easier, let's not encrypt this password. Okay, let's just say it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Like this, we don't have to call the function twice. So in this case, we don't have to encrypt it. To decrypt it, all we have to say is the passcode that I entered in here, is it the same as the decryption of the password that we found in the database? Okay, this is exactly what this function is doing. And if it's the case, then what we need to do, and this is the first functionality that we're going to use out of the auth.com, is we are going to authorize this user. So this user is now authorized to work. And if not, let's just echo something for now. It would help, at least for testing purposes, not authorized. That's awesome. And this should be it, if we think about it. We almost got it all. So what we need to do now, because we already have our route in there, is obviously we need to test. But before we do that, let's just double check on the code. Yeah, it seems to be okay. Great. Now, it would be good to test out whether or not this worked. Okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to log in, but then we're going to test out an action in Poster Controller to see if the user is allowed, is authorized. But if you think about it, there is nothing in here that tells me or that puts a guard on the user or on checking whether the user is authorized or not. So what we're going to do is for the index function of this, well, we're going to check if the user is authorized. And there is here's method number 2 of auth.php, which is the Boolean method that checks if a user is authorized. So what we're going to say is if authorized, or let's do the opposite, if it's not authorized, then in that case, echo not authorized. And in any other case, let's echo yay. Okay? And then it's going to dump the other information, which is the information about the poster. So let's see if this whole thing worked or not. Going back to user controller, so after we authorize in here, let's say echo it worked. Okay? All this is for testing purposes, of course. So now let's go back here. Now what we're going to do is we're really going to call the login function. Oh, ideally it worked. So now if I go back here, yay, okay, now my login worked. Okay, you might not be convinced yet. So let me show you a logout function. Let's create a logout function so that we do this in 2 separate instances. So let's do a logout. And what this logout is going to do, it's going to be calling, sorry for that, it's going to be calling one of the core methods that is called logout, but we're not going to give it any Yeah, let's give it one. No, let's not give it one. So we're just going to say logout, and ideally it should take you back to the root. And when we go back to the root, ideally this should say not authorized. So let's see if our logic works. Okay, if not, we'll fix it. But let's see if it works. So right now I'm logged in. So ideally it should be fine. Now let's log out. We did not have a route for it, of course. So now let's go back here and create a route for that thing. So log out, and then we're going to say it's user controller at logout. Never forget to create a route whenever needed. Okay, so let's go here, logout, not authorized. Okay. What we need to do, so it continued in the thing, what we need to do in here, why? Because it's just an echo, is we need to exit. If we don't exit or die or what have you, then in that case it's going to keep continuing the code. That is exactly what it's doing in here. So let's go back here. Not authorized now. Great, I'm not authorized. Now let's log in. It worked. Okay, so now if I go back to my index, yay, it's working. Let's call logout again. Oop, I'm no longer authorized to do anything. Okay, so we just recreated in a very simplistic way our authentication mechanism. And no matter how complex things get, the logic of authentication is always almost the same, okay? It's always about registering the user and then trying to log them in. And then, you know, depending on how you want to implement the authorization piece of it, that will depend on your application. But overall, the structural logic of it is the same. So if you apply the routes correctly, if you create the methods correctly, then your authentication should be easy. Okay, that's if you want to do it all in a custom way and not use what is provided to you by Caligraphy. All right. So now that we've done this, now we're going to ignore it. Okay. Because what I'm going to show you next is how we could completely use the solution that is given to us by Caligraphy. In order to do that, let's keep our classes. We're not going to change that, but let's comment out the routes because we don't want conflicts in here. So let's comment these out, and what we're going to do is we're going to activate everything that's under this last paragraph that tells us that those are the routes that are needed to create all the forms that are necessary for us to add users, to register them, and to log them in, and to log them out. Let's go and take a look, just by simply activating this, how the application is going to work out. So what this tells me is first I need to go to something called home. So let's go to home. Wow, okay. This is my home now. Now I see two buttons on top, one that is signing in and one that is register. Now ideally if I click on sign in, I should get to a login form. Yep, I do get to a login form. So now if I go in here, ideally if I do test and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, this is an item in our database, ideally it should work. You are currently logged in. It did identify our user. Great. Now let's sign up. Great. Now let's go register another user. Let's say this is going to be test 2. And we're going to give test 2 the same password, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And we're going to say create. Okay, ideally it created it. And now if I do test 2 and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and access, I am currently logged in. So this is the framework, the module of authentication that comes out of the box with Caligraphy. Now you notice that there is a UI implicated in this. This UI is driven by the views that we've seen earlier in the poster, in the auth controller that is given out of the box. So there are views in here that define all these forms, and we will talk about these a little further in our videos. So this is really what authentication is about. This is what the package that comes out of the box from Calligraphy behaves. What you need to remember in what we've seen today is that what comes packaged out of the box still needs to be activated. And if you want to activate all this, you please follow the instructions that are in here. And these instructions are exactly what I showed you today in the video. What you need to remember mainly is of course you need to create the table using the SQL statement that is script that is given to you. If you make any modifications to the namings, then you got to make sure that your models and the properties within your models mirror what's in the SQL table. Make sure to activate the authentication in the web.php file. If you want to use the package entirely the way Calligraphy gives it, using its own pages, then make sure to uncomment the routes that are given to you out of the box. And if not, if you want to create your own controller, then please feel free to do it just like we did it together today. With that, I hope you enjoyed this video, and in our next videos we're going to dig further into some other modules and some other sections of our documentation. You have a great day. Thank you.